Hey, what's happening, A-Push kids? We're here for our first lecture in period 4, our third unit. We're going to be covering topic 4.2, the rise of political parties and the era of Jefferson. Today's lesson, we're going to be looking at learning objective 4B. We're going to be trying to explain the causes and effects of policy debates in the early republic, especially during the presidency of Thomas Jefferson. So before we kind of jump into everything, we're going to be referring to the time period that we're currantly in as the antebellum era. So basically what we're going to have here is we're going to have this time period that goes from 1800 all the way to 1860. This is the era before the bellum. The bellum's the war, the Civil War. And everything that is before the Civil War is called the antebellum era, typically between 1800 and 1860. The unit that we're going to be in right here is we're going to be going from 1800 right here where Jefferson's re-elected in 1804. We're going to go through Madison, Monroe, the very short John Quincy Adams presidency, Jackson through Van Buren, Tyler, Harrison, and that's where we're going to kind of end right about in here, right around that 1840, 1844 mark. And so this unit is going to mostly cover the early antebellum era. Our next unit is going to cover from the late antebellum era all the way through the Civil War and Reconstruction. So let's go ahead and kind of get started here with our first key idea, which says that in the late 1800s, national political parties continued to debate issues such as the tariff, powers of the federal government, and relations with European powers. And this is kind of much the same argument that we had kind of left off with. All right. So in our last lecture, in the last unit, we talked about, the very last thing we talked about was this revolution of 1800. We talked about how this revolution, this election was such a turning point in U.S. history. It was the first time that we ever had political parties transferring power from one to another. And so in a way, this was a peaceful revolution. That's a really big deal at the time. Most countries, when you change political parties, when an entirely new group of people come in with an entirely new idea of how to do things, there's usually unrest. There's usually war of some sort. But that wasn't the case. It was just an election. And it was a close one, and it was a bitter one. It was a really nasty one. And both Jefferson and Adams said some really nasty things about each other in this particular election. But at the end of the day, Jefferson wins. Adams goes home. And although he hates Jefferson for quite some time for losing, they end up becoming friends later on. And in his inaugural address in 1801, Jefferson does what is hard for many politicians to be able to do, and that's try and bring everybody back together. He says that we are all Republicans, we are all Federalists, this idea that we're all kind of in this together. Now, Jefferson's going to bring a very different idea. Jefferson believed that America should be an agrarian republic that protected liberty. And he very much wanted within this kind of concept that the future of America was in the farmers. We kind of see in this political advertisement from the election of 1800, this idea of the American agrarian society. And as such, they opposed tariffs, they wanted a weaker central government, and they were typically pro-French. And so we contrast this with the Federalist Party because these ideas are going to continue to plague Jefferson and Madison kind of going forward. The Federalists, on the other hand, they really don't want to see their policies destroyed by Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans. They wanted a protective tariff, they wanted a stronger government, and they were pro-British. These are kind of the central tenets. And so these national political parties, they're going to continue these kind of arguments throughout really this entire unit, though the Federalists will end up kind of rebranding themselves a little bit later on. Which then brings us to the second key idea. And the second key idea says Supreme Court decisions establish the primacy of the judiciary in determining the meaning of the Constitution and asserted that federal laws took precedent over state laws. Now, the election of 1800 was not just when Adams loses the presidency and Jefferson gains it. The Federalists lost badly across the board. Now, you may remember the very important controversial law and actions of Adams, the XYZ affair, followed by the Alien Sedition Act. And this made the Federalists very, very unpopular nationally. And so not only does Adams lose his position, but also a lot of Federalists are kicked out of office. And the Democratic Republicans are able to gain a lot of power, not only in the executive branch, but also as well in the legislative branch in both Congress and the Senate. But Adams does have kind of one bastion of power, one last kind of stronghold of power that he has, and that is the federal judiciary. Because one of the key parts of this separation of power and checks and balances that we talked about in the last unit that was brought into the Constitution was not only does the president not only can they veto acts of Congress, but they also get to appoint federal judges whenever there's a vacancy. And right before leaving office, there were several vacancies in the Supreme Court or in the court system. And so Adams, right before he leaves office, fills them and appoints them. They become known as the midnight judges. Now, Jefferson doesn't like these people, right? And for the most part because they're politically opposed to him. And he feels that he should have had the opportunity to appoint these people. Now, constitutionally, Adams is completely in the right in this, but we can understand why Jefferson felt like he should have the power to appoint these people. These people are not elected, they're appointed, and they're there now for life. Jefferson feels like he's going to have to fight these different judges for a while. And we even see our current presidents, both the one that we have right now, the one before, even the one before that, would sometimes complain about judges that had been appointed by previous presidents that would undermine their policies. So this is a long-standing thing that has been going on for quite some time. Well, anyways, Jefferson orders his Secretary of State, James Madison, to deny some of these judicial appointments that he's supposed to deliver. One of them was a guy named William Marbury. And Marbury does the American thing. He sues Madison when he was deprived of his position, when Madison refused to bring the document saying that he had been appointed to him and giving him this appointment. The court case becomes known as Marbury v. Madison, which is how court cases are usually listed. You've got the plaintiff followed by the defendant, the person that is suing, followed by the person being sued. So Marbury v. Madison happens in 1803, and it becomes one of the most important Supreme Court cases in U.S. history. Now, how the whole thing ended up working out was not to really Marbury's liking. The Supreme Court ruled that Jefferson's decision to deny Marbury his judicial appointment did not violate the Judiciary Act or the Constitution. So essentially, Marbury doesn't get his appointment. But what they are able to establish, most importantly, right, the Marbury v. Madison case establishes a principle that's called judicial review. And what this does is it gives the Supreme Court the power to declare acts of Congress unconstitutional. And this becomes incredibly important. And it's all organized and orchestrated by really the last Federalist on the Supreme Court, the last really Federalist that has major power. And his name is John Marshall. And he serves as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court from 1801 to 1835. And he's there for 3 decades. He strengthens the power of the national government over the states and helps to protect the rights of citizens. He is incredibly influential. Right? Going back to that key idea, which says the Supreme Court decisions establish the primacy of the judiciary in determining the meaning of the Constitution. That's that Marbury v. Madison case, and asserted that federal laws took precedent over state laws. That's the Supremacy Clause, and John Marshall is central to all that. And he does so through several different court cases, and they're listed here. All right, we don't need to necessarily go into every one. We just talked about Marbury v. Madison. Some of the other ones that are important include things like McClure v. Maryland, which said that states could not tax the federal bank. The power to tax is the power to destroy, according to John Marshall. Later on, Gibbons v. Ogden, another famous one from 1824. John Marshall rules that the states could not interfere with interstate trade. Only the federal government could regulate interstate trade. So all of these are different ways where John Marshall is strengthening the power of the federal government over the states. He is the last Federalist in national power. Leading us, finally, to key idea number 3. Key idea number 3 states, following the Louisiana Purchase, the U.S. government sought influence and control over North America through a variety of means, including exploration and diplomatic efforts. So we want to kind of look at how exploration and diplomatic efforts are going to be important to our trying to assert control over North America. So first, why do we need to expand? All right, so during Jefferson's presidency, we see the U.S. population growing. All right, we see for instance, on the graph on the bottom left, from 1800 to 1810, we grow by 2 million people. Between 1800 and about 1850, we are doubling every 25 years. The U.S. is growing by leaps and bounds. And on top of that, people are moving west. Right? And new states are being added all the time. We can see on the map not only when new states are added, such as Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, but also how those kind of strands of civilization are moving westward. We're definitely over the Appalachians now. Before, it seemed just like a few days ago when we're talking about the Proclamation of 1763, we couldn't cross the Appalachians, and now here we are, we're all the way at the Mississippi River now. We have definitely people that have settled all the way across Kentucky into Ohio, into Illinois. They're going into what is present-day Missouri at this point. But Jefferson was worried about French control, especially of New Orleans and the Mississippi River. The French had just recently gained control of New Orleans. They'd taken over it from the Spanish, and they could potentially close down access to that very important port that you see down there at the bottom of the map, and really shut off the economic access to those people across the Appalachians. And we talked about why that was important when we talked about Pinckney's Treaty and access for what was called the right of deposit in New Orleans. So what Jefferson does is Jefferson sends a delegation to France, and he just wants to purchase just the city of New Orleans. That's really all they're interested in, is just buy the city, get the port, and that's really all he wants. But Napoleon, he doesn't really see it like that. I mean, he as much as he would love an American empire, he realizes that he needs more money to fund his wars. And so he offers to sell the entire thing to us for the mere price of $15 million. And even in money at that time, that was a steal. And so Congress in 1803 is going to approve this purchase, $15 million bucks. It doubles the size of the United States. It is a giant coup for the United States. And we're really, really excited about this. Many Americans were, but it does present problems for us. For Jefferson in particular, was the purchase constitutional? Now, Jefferson believed in this idea of a strict interpretation. However, he's going to use the elastic clause of the Constitution, the idea that he can do things that are necessary and proper to buy this particular territory. The second problem was, what did we buy? We had no idea what was out there. So to solve the first issue, or the second issue, I should say, Jefferson's going to send Lewis and Clark. They're going to explore that territory. There's a painting of them out there exploring. There's another one. Well, anyways, their findings are going to reveal an abundance of natural resources for America. Now, Jefferson, because of all this, really popular. Easily wins re-election 1804. You can see the map there. But like most presidents that we're going to talk about, their second terms are usually less successful. Huge foreign policy problems. There's still the war that's happening between England and France, and this leads to more attacks on U.S. ships. The British Navy, for instance, is going to impress or basically capture more than 1,000 American merchant sailors between 1803 and 1807. Jefferson, incredibly frustrated by this, especially by his inability to get England and France to stop these ships, passes what's called the Embargo Act of 1807, banning all trade with England and France. The problem is, though, we are reliant on this trade, not them. And so the embargo fails. Merchants smuggled goods and continued to trade with Europe. And really, at the end of the day, the embargo hurt U.S. trade more than England and France, sending the United States into an economic slump towards the end of Jefferson's presidency. Well, that ends our discussion of Jefferson and his presidency. The ups and downs of his first term led into his second term, the expansion of federal power with the judicial branch, and the continued arguments between the different branches. Until next time, go Pack.